I'm 30 years old now, but my life took a turn most people wouldn't believe when I was just 6. My twin brother Aaron and I grew up in a struggling household. Money was always tight, and our parents constantly stressed about bills. But even as a kid, I could tell that things weren't the same for both of us. Aaron always got more, better toys, more attention, softer words. If one of us got in trouble, it was always me. If one of us needed something, he got it first. At first, I didn't question it. He was my twin, my best friend. I figured this was just how families worked. But looking back, the signs were all there. Then, one day, everything changed. It was summer, and our parents sat us down. They told me I was going to visit my grandfather for a little while. Just for the summer, they said. It would be fun. Grandpa would spoil me, and they would be back before I knew it. I was excited. A whole summer with Grandpa? No rules. No fights over toys. No getting scolded for things that Aaron did first. Sounded good to me. I packed a small bag. My parents drove me to Grandpa's house, a small, cozy place a few hours away. They stayed for dinner, acted like everything was normal, and the next morning they were gone. I counted the days. 1 week, 2 weeks, 3. I started asking Grandpa when they were coming back. He kept saying, soon, but then I saw the worry in his face, the way he hesitated before answering. And finally, one evening, he sat me down at the kitchen table and told me the truth. They're not coming back. I didn't understand. How could they just leave? Didn't they say it was only for the summer? Grandpa tried to comfort me, saying that I would always have a home with him, but all I could focus on was the emptiness. I waited for a phone call, a letter, a visit. Nothing. Eventually I stopped waiting. Life with Grandpa was different, but it was good. He wasn't rich, but he was kind. He made sure I had food, clothes, and a roof over my head. He didn't treat me like an extra mouth to feed or a burden. I was just his grandson, and that was enough for him. Over the years, I caught glimpses of Aaron's life, through relatives, through whispers. He was thriving, private schools, vacations, a new house in another state. He had everything. And me, I had a second-hand winter coat and part-time jobs before I was even a teenager. The real gut punch came when I was 15. That's when I found out that my parents hadn't just left me behind, they had erased me. They had moved across the country and told everyone they had one son. No one knew I existed. No old pictures, no stories, nothing. They had rewritten reality to fit their perfect little family. That was the moment I stopped wondering why they left. I had my answer. By the time I turned 18, I had no more illusions. They had chosen their life without me, and I wasn't going to waste my time chasing after people who had made it clear I wasn't wanted. When I was 22, Grandpa passed away. It was the hardest moment of my life, but I pushed through. I worked, saved, built my own life. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Then, out of nowhere, a name I hadn't seen in decades popped up on my phone screen. Aaron, a friend request. I stared at it for a long time. It felt like a ghost had reached out from the past. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity won. I clicked. One message. We need to talk. It's important. I didn't know what to think. Why now? What could he possibly want? I hadn't spoken to him in years. I debated blocking him. But then, against my better judgment, I replied, "What do you want?" The answer came almost instantly. "Mom and Dad want to see you. They want to reconnect." I should have left it at that. Should have shut the door and never looked back. But something about it gnawed at me. I didn't want them back in my life. I didn't need their apologies, but I needed to know why. So I said yes. I agreed to meet them, and I had no idea just how insane their real reason was. I agreed to meet them, not because I wanted to forgive them, not because I was curious about their lives, but because I needed to hear it from their own mouths. I needed to know why. After all these years, they suddenly wanted to reconnect. Aaron sent the location, a high-end restaurant in the city, the kind of place where a single meal probably cost what I used to make in a week, the kind of place my parents wouldn't have taken me to even if I had grown up with them. I arrived on time. They were already there. Aaron was the first to notice me. He smiled, waved me over. He looked like someone who had never struggled a day in his life. Nice clothes, expensive watch, confident posture. My mother sat beside him, forcing a wide smile, but her eyes darted nervously. My father, on the other hand, didn't even look up. I sat down. The air was thick with tension. The kind of tension you get when people are pretending everything is fine when it really isn't. The first few minutes were small talk, forced pleasantries. My mother kept saying how much I had grown up. My father still wouldn't look at me. Aaron, though, seemed genuine. He told me he was glad I came, that he had wanted to reach out sooner. But before he could say more, my mother cut in. She sighed, clasped her hands together, and launched into what was clearly a rehearsed speech. She talked about regret, about how hard things had been, about how they had always loved me, even if their actions didn't show it. And then she got to the real reason we were there. Aaron was sick. A serious condition. He needed a matching donor, and as his identical twin, I was the best possible match. That was it. That was the reason for the sudden interest in me after 30 years. Not because they missed me, not because they cared, because they needed something. I sat there, letting the words settle, My mother's eyes welled up with tears. She called me their only hope. My father, still refusing to meet my eyes, muttered something about how it was the least I could do. Aaron, to his credit, looked uncomfortable. He admitted he didn't know how badly they had cut me off, that he always assumed they at least kept in touch. My mother went on about how we were still family, how the past didn't matter now, how they just wanted a second chance. And then, as if she had been waiting for the perfect moment, she pulled out a small envelope, slid it across the table. I opened it. Old baby photos. Pictures of me and Aaron as infants, as toddlers, side by side. Pictures of a life before they threw me away. The manipulation was so obvious, it was almost insulting. I put the envelope down and finally spoke. I laid it all out. The abandonment, the silence, the lies, the fact that they had erased me from their lives so completely that they told people I never existed. I asked if they would have ever reached out if Aaron hadn't gotten sick. Silence. My mother's lip trembled. My father finally looked up. His expression was flat, unreadable. Then he spoke. He said I had a good life with my grandfather, that I shouldn't hold grudges, that we all make mistakes. I laughed, actually laughed. Aaron, meanwhile, looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. He tried to defend them, said it wasn't that simple, that they did what they thought was best at the time. I asked if they had ever even once tried to check on me, if they had ever wondered how I was doing. More silence. And then my mother broke down. Tears, shaking hands, sobbing about how she regretted everything, how she knew they had made mistakes, but I was their son, and Aaron was my brother, and wasn't family supposed to be there for each other? That was the final straw. I stood up, told them I needed time to think, walked out before they could say anything else. Aaron followed me outside. He said he understood if I never wanted to see them again, but he was sorry. He said he didn't want to pressure me, but his life was on the line. He asked me to at least consider it. I didn't respond, just walked away. Later that night, I vented online. I didn't say it was me, just laid out the situation in a post. The responses were mixed. Some people said, family is family. You only get one brother. Others said, they abandoned you. You owe them nothing. I already knew where I stood, but I wasn't done yet. This wasn't over. After the disaster of that meeting, I went straight to my best friend's place. I laid everything out. The sudden reconnection, the guilt tripping, the way my parents had erased me from their lives until they needed something from me. My friend didn't hold back. The reaction was immediate. Outrage, disbelief. How could they throw me away like trash, then waltz back in, acting like nothing happened, and then expect me to risk my life for them? That conversation cemented something in me. This wasn't just messed up. It was calculated. So I started digging. I researched Aaron's condition, expecting to find that he was truly out of options. Instead, I found that while his situation was serious, it wasn't as dire as my parents had claimed. A transplant was an option, but not the only one. He had alternatives, other treatments that could buy him time. Time my parents weren't willing to wait for. That's when I realized, this wasn't about urgency. This wasn't a desperate last resort plea to save his life. This was them taking the easiest way out. The next few days, the messages started. My mother was relentless. Every morning, another text, another voicemail, another guilt trip. You're his only hope. Don't do this to your own brother. We can fix things, be a family again. They escalated fast. Missed calls turned into paragraphs of emotional blackmail. Then came the baby pictures again. Then, the long rambling voicemails about how much they regretted everything. Aaron reached out separately. His tone was different. He wasn't begging, just apologizing, saying he understood if I said no, that he didn't want me to feel forced. But something about that felt off too. So I kept digging. I reached out to an old relative, someone who had been on the outskirts of the family drama for years. That's when I learned the truth. My parents had planned to abandon me before I was even born. According to this relative, before my mother gave birth, she and my father had talked about how they only wanted one child. Raising twins would be too hard, especially with their financial struggles. But when we were born, they kept both of us. For a while, the favoritism started immediately. Aaron got the attention, the affection, the investment, and I was extra. They had always planned to leave me behind. They just needed to figure out when. That summer trip to Grandpa's. It wasn't a last-minute decision. It wasn't a tough choice they made under pressure. It was the plan all along. That was bad enough. But what came next? That was worse. I reached out to an aunt I barely spoke to anymore. I asked if she knew anything about how my parents explained my absence over the years. She hesitated. Then she told me. They told people I had died. At least, that was the story they crafted for their new social circle. For old friends and distant family, they simply avoided the subject. They got rid of my pictures, stopped mentioning me, and over time I faded from existence in their world. If anyone asked, they brushed it off. It wasn't that they had erased me overnight. They had rewritten history slowly, piece by piece. That's why none of their friends knew about me. That's why there were no pictures. That's why Aaron had never questioned it. They erased me. I needed to see it for myself. I found my parents' social media accounts, and sure enough, there was no trace of me. Their posts stretched back years, filled with updates on Aaron's accomplishments, their new house, their vacations. No other son, no mentions of the past. I scrolled through post after post, looking for anything. A picture, a comment, a throwback post. Nothing. They had rewritten history. And now, they didn't just want my organ. They wanted me to take Aaron's place if he died. I sat with that for a long time before I picked up my phone and called them. The second my mother answered, she was already emotional, talking fast, trying to control the conversation. She kept saying she knew I was hurt, but I needed to look past that we had a second chance to be a family. I cut her off. I told her I knew everything. The abandonment, the lies, the fake story about my death. The fact that they had been planning this since day one. She didn't deny it. She just stumbled over her words, saying they did what they had to do. My father chimed in, his voice steady. He said, "We did what was best, not for me, just best for them." I told them to stop pretending this was about family. They never wanted me back until they needed something. Then I asked the final question. If Aaron weren't sick, would they have ever reached out? Silence. That silence told me everything I needed to know. I hung up, and now I had a choice to make. Walk away forever, or burn the bridge completely. After that phone call I was done. No more back and forth. No more letting them pull me into their mess. I blocked my parents on everything. Calls, texts, social media. I didn't just want distance. I wanted them out of my life completely. Aaron was the last one I hadn't blocked. Not yet. His messages were different from theirs. Less manipulative, more regretful. But it didn't change the fact that he had been part of the life I was erased from. The life where I had been written out like I never existed. Before I could make a decision about him, my phone rang. It was my aunt, one of the few extended family members I still spoke to. She didn't waste time. She had heard about what happened, and she had a warning. My parents were furious, not just upset. Furious. They weren't going to let this go. They were telling anyone who would listen that I was a selfish, heartless person who had turned his back on his own twin brother. She told me they were reaching out to the rest of the family, twisting the story to make it sound like I was the one abandoning them. I barely had time to process that before another message came in, this time from Aaron. It was short. He apologized again, said he didn't blame me if I never wanted to speak to him again. He said he had no idea how badly our parents had treated me, that he had only recently found out just how deep the lies went. I didn't respond. I blocked his number. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The next day, I started getting messages from family members I barely spoke to. Cousins, distant relatives, people I hadn't seen in years. Some of them were angry, repeating the same story my parents had told them, how I had abandoned my family when they needed me most. Others weren't so quick to take sides. They asked questions, wanted to hear my side. And then, something I didn't expect, some of them defended me. Some relatives outright called out my parents. They reminded them loudly and publicly that I was the one who had been abandoned first, that my parents had left me behind by choice, and ignored me for almost 3 decades. That threw a wrench in their narrative. So they switched tactics. The next thing I heard, they were telling people I hadn't been abandoned, just sent somewhere better, that they had done what was best for me, that they had always planned to bring me back into the family, but circumstances got in the way. It was complete nonsense. I ignored it, until my manager called me into his office. He looked uncomfortable, like he didn't want to have the conversation he was about to have. My mother had called my workplace, weaving a dramatic story about a family emergency. My manager caught off guard, took down her number but didn't pass it to me immediately. When I explained the situation, how I had been abandoned and was only being contacted now for selfish reasons, he understood. He told the receptionist to block any further calls from them. When he asked for details, she got vague, saying it was about a medical crisis and that I was making a huge mistake. He hadn't given her any information, but he wanted to know what was going on. I told him the truth, at least the basic version of it, that my parents had cut me off decades ago and were only reaching out now for selfish reasons. He nodded, said he wouldn't let them harass me at work, and told the receptionist not to take any more calls from them. But now it was clear. Blocking them wasn't enough. They were going to force their way back into my life if I didn't put up stronger barriers. I reached out to a lawyer friend. I wanted to know, could they force me to donate? Could they take legal action? The answer was no. They couldn't make me do anything. But my friend warned me. They might try to manipulate the situation. Emotional pressure, social pressure, even legal threats, just to scare me into compliance. I needed to be ready. Then, out of nowhere, a mutual friend sent me a message. Aaron had reached out to them. He told them he had no idea our parents were harassing me. He said he hadn't been told about the calls, the family smear campaign, or the workplace interference. He was furious. A few hours later, I got an email from him. He said he was done with them, that after hearing about what they had been doing, he confronted them, asked them why they were going this far, why they were trying to force my hand. They deflected, made excuses, but in the end they admitted the truth. At first they showered me with guilt-tripping messages, reminiscing about how I was still their son and how family sticks together. But when I didn't fall for it, their desperation escalated. I wasn't just a donor to them, I was their backup plan, their second attempt at the perfect son. That was it for him. He told me he was cutting ties, that he understood why I didn't want anything to do with them, that he wouldn't reach out again unless I wanted him to. I didn't respond. I just sat there reading the email over and over again. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the only one walking away from them, and for the first time they were completely truly alone. Blocking them didn't stop them. Cutting them off didn't stop them. Even Aaron walking away didn't stop them. They were still trying to control the story. Family members I hadn't spoken to in years were reaching out, either demanding answers or trying to guilt me. Some believed the version of events my parents had spread, that I was heartless, that I was letting my own twins suffer. Others wanted to know the truth, whispering that they had always suspected something was off about my parents' story. I was done letting them twist things. So, I exposed everything. I wrote it all down, every detail. The favoritism, the abandonment, the way they erased me from their lives, how they told people I had died, how they only reached out when they needed my body. I didn't post it under my real name, but I made sure the right people saw it. And once the truth was out, it spread fast. Relatives who thought I had been dead for decades lost it. Some reached out in complete disbelief, asking if I was actually alive. Others confronted my parents directly, demanding answers, and then their real nightmare began. Their friends saw it, their neighbors saw it. People they had spent years lying to, building a perfect image for, suddenly weren't so sure about them anymore. And the worst part, they had no defense. They had no pictures of me, no stories, nothing to prove that I had been a real part of their lives, because as far as they were concerned, I never existed. Their perfect lie fell apart. It didn't take long before Aaron reached out again, this time from a new number. He had seen the post. He had seen the reaction. At first, he struggled to accept it. Part of him still clung to the belief that our parents couldn't have been that cruel. But as more details surfaced and old family members confirmed my side, denial turned to anger. He had spent weeks trying to justify their actions, only to realize there was no excuse. And that destroyed him. But the family was split. Some relatives took my side immediately, shocked by what they had never known. They had assumed my absence was a quiet estrangement, not a full erasure. Others, who had known bits and pieces but had never questioned it, struggled with guilt. And then there were those who still pushed the tired excuse. But they're still your parents. As if biology alone made up for decades of abandonment. And then came my parents' response. Not an apology, not an explanation. Pure, blind outrage. They called me a traitor, said I had betrayed the family by airing private family matters, that I was making them look bad for no reason. They weren't mad about what they had done. They were mad about being caught. But that wasn't the worst part. A few days later, a cousin reached out. They had overheard something during a heated argument between my parents and another family member. It wasn't just about the donation. They needed money. Aaron's treatment wasn't cheap. Insurance wasn't covering everything. They had assumed I would not only agree to the surgery, but also help pay for it. That's why they pushed so hard. That's why they were trying to force me back into the family. I wasn't just a donor to them. I was a wallet. Aaron found out around the same time I did, and that was his breaking point. He confronted them. He demanded to know if they had only reached out because they needed something. If they had ever really planned to let him reconnect with me as his brother, or if I was just a backup plan. They dodged the question. They refused to answer. That was enough for him. He told them he was done. And then, a few days later, I got a letter. A formal cease and desist from a lawyer. They were trying to shut me up. It was nonsense, of course. Nothing in my post was a lie. They couldn't force me to stop talking. But it was their last, desperate attempt to control the situation. I ignored it. My own lawyer confirmed they had no case. That's when they played their final card. They told extended family that if Aaron died, it would be my fault. That was the last straw. Aaron publicly disowned them. He put it all in writing. He posted his own message, making it clear he wanted nothing to do with them. They had destroyed their own family, not me. And with that, their final lifeline was gone. Their golden child, their only son, the one they had chosen over me. He was done with them too. And for the first time in my life, the guilt, the weight I had carried for years, wondering if I should have tried harder, if I should have done more, it finally disappeared. I didn't owe them anything. And now, they had nothing. After Aaron publicly disowned them, everything should have been over. They had no more power, no more control, no more excuses. But instead of finally accepting the consequences of their actions, my parents did what they always did. They doubled down. It started with an email. My mother suddenly very sick. Terminal, she claimed. She needed to see me one last time before it was too late. The wording was dramatic, full of regret, of pain, of wanting to make amends before she left this world. At first I ignored it, but then doubt crept in. Could it be real? Could she actually be dying? As much as I hated them, the idea of her actually being sick was something I had to at least consider. Before I made a decision, I reached out to Aaron. He didn't even hesitate. It was a lie. She was perfectly fine. No hospital visits, no medical emergencies, no diagnosis. It was just another tactic, another guilt trip. And it wasn't just me she was targeting. Within hours of that email, I started seeing the Facebook posts, long rambling paragraphs about how her own son had abandoned her in her final days, how she had tried so hard to be forgiven, how I was cruel and cold-hearted for refusing to see her even as she was dying. The comments were a mixed bag. Some people bought into it, offering sympathy and outrage on her behalf. Others weren't so convinced. The truth had already spread too far, and plenty of people called her out. She didn't stop. A few days later, another message, this time from my father, short, blunt, straight to the point. I hope you can live with yourself if Aaron dies. That was it. That was their last move. Trying to dump all the responsibility onto me, as if I hadn't been erased from their family decades ago. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, but that wasn't the end of it. They weren't satisfied with just emails and Facebook rants, so they showed up, at my workplace. Security caught them before they could get inside. My mother was in full dramatic mode, crying, pleading, trying to get past the front desk. My father stood next to her, playing the silent, disappointed act, like he was just a poor man watching his family fall apart. They demanded to see me. Security refused. They caused a scene. They got kicked off the property. And just like that, their last stand crumbled. After that, things got worse. For them, their smear campaign backfired. The more they pushed, the more people started turning against them. People who had once defended them, who had believed their lies, began to question everything. Neighbors, family friends, even some of the relatives who had initially taken their side started pulling away. Because at the end of the day, they couldn't escape the one truth that ruined them. They had abandoned their child. They had chosen their golden son, erased the other, and only came crawling back when they needed something. Now they had nothing. Word spread that they were struggling. Their finances had never been as stable as they pretended. Between their lavish spending and medical bills, the cracks had already been forming. With Aaron cutting them off and no one left to manipulate, they had no choice. They moved away, hoping to start fresh somewhere else. No dramatic goodbyes, no last messages. They simply disappeared from the community they had spent years pretending to be perfect in. And Aaron? Aaron reached out one final time, not to ask for anything, not to apologize, just to tell me that he was moving forward. He was focusing on alternative treatments, doing everything he could to fight his condition without them dragging him down. He told me that he finally understood, that no matter how much he had been favored, it had never really been about love. It had always been about control. That was the last time we spoke. And for the first time in my life, I had true freedom. No more messages, no more manipulation, no more guilt. I deleted their numbers, blocked every possible contact. And then, I moved on. I thought it was over. They had moved away. Their lies had collapsed. Aaron had disowned them. Their manipulation tactics had failed. But people like them, they don't just give up. It started with a voicemail, an unfamiliar number, a law firm. The message was formal, cold, something about urgent legal matters related to my parents. No details, no explanations, just a number to call back immediately. I didn't panic. I had dealt with enough of their nonsense to know this was just another attempt to pull me back in. Still, I forwarded the voicemail to my lawyer. It didn't take long for him to confirm it. A baseless scare tactic. There was no real legal issue. They had nothing on me, but they were trying to make it sound serious enough to scare me into responding. I ignored it. That's when they escalated. Days later, my lawyer called me again, this time with actual documents. A lawsuit. According to my parents, I was cruelly abandoning Aaron in his time of need. They filed a frivolous lawsuit, knowing full well they had no legal standing, but hoping the threat alone would pressure me into compliance. It was ridiculous. It had no legal standing, but it wasn't about winning. It was about pressure. They wanted to force me into the conversation, to make me engage. My lawyer wasted no time shutting it down. He filed a cease and desist, warning them that if they continued this harassment, they could face legal consequences. That should have been enough. But then Aaron found out, and he lost it. He confronted them, not just in private but in public. For years he had ignored the red flags. He had believed their version of the story, the softened, watered-down lies they had fed him. But this was too far. He didn't just call them out, he exposed everything. He wrote a post detailing the truth, how they abandoned me, how they erased me from their lives, how they only reached out when they needed something. He told everyone that the lawsuit was a lie, that he had never asked them to do it, that this wasn't about helping him, it was about control, and that was it. The final straw. Their last defenders, the few people who still believed them, vanished. The last pieces of their reputation crumbled. Even the law firm backed out. I got a call from my lawyer the next morning. The lawsuit had been dropped. Quietly overnight. They knew they had lost, but they still had one last move. A final email. The subject line, "One last chance." It was long, dramatic, full of emotional manipulation. She told me she would forgive me if I just fixed things, if I just helped bring the family back together, if I just understood how much they loved me. I didn't read past the first paragraph. I deleted it. And for the first time, they had nothing left. Aaron messaged me one last time. He told me that he was done with them. Truly, that he wasn't just cutting them off, he was moving forward, without them hanging over his life. He was exploring alternative treatments. He was taking control of his own health, without their influence, without their pressure. He told me he wouldn't ask for help again. And that was the end of it. My parents were alone now. No golden child, no allies, no power. For the first time in my life, I had won, and they could never hurt me again. I had to make sure they couldn't reach me. It was over. I'd already cut ties with them, but it wasn't enough. I couldn't leave any room for them to worm their way back in. So I did what I had to do. I changed my number. I moved. I made sure there were no loose ends for them to latch onto. I told only the people who truly mattered where I was. The rest, they didn't need to know. While I was putting distance between myself and that toxic past, Aaron was doing the same thing, but in his own way. He started therapy. After everything that had happened, it was clear to both of us that he needed to rebuild, and he had to do it without our parents' influence hanging over him. Therapy helped him process years of being manipulated and gaslit. He slowly started finding himself again, and as expected, he fully cut ties with them. No more contact. No more emotional blackmail. Aaron had made his peace with the fact that they were never going to change. The final push came when he publicly denounced them. He made a final statement online. Everything he had been holding back came out. He made it clear that they were the problem, that they were the ones who abandoned me, not the other way around. He said he couldn't be a part of their toxic cycle anymore. It was like a weight had been lifted. And yet their desperation didn't end. Our mother posted a sob story online. It was classic. The emotional plea, the crying, the poor me routine. She claimed to be the victim, writing about how her sons had abandoned her, and how she was now suffering without us. She begged for sympathy, hoping that the online world would rally behind her. But this time, no one bought it. People who had been on her side before started commenting, calling her out. The backlash was swift. They reminded her, in no uncertain terms, that she had abandoned me first. They weren't buying the poor mother act anymore. And that's when it hit. The complete social collapse. Every corner of her life that had been propped up by lies came crashing down. Their friends, those who had defended them for so long, started to see them for what they really were. They had manipulated everyone. As the weeks went by, the fallout continued. I heard through some family members that they were drowning in debt. All those medical costs for Aaron had taken a massive toll on their finances. The money they had been spending on trying to keep up appearances was no longer sustainable. It didn't take long for the news to spread. And with it came the complete isolation. No one, not a single person, stepped in to help them. I heard they had to sell everything. Their house, their car, anything of value, just to stay afloat. The image of the family they had spent decades building was completely gone. And Aaron, he had a fresh start. With the help of his therapy and his own resolve, Aaron got a new job, started rebuilding his life piece by piece. He was learning how to live without their toxic influence. He was moving forward, no longer shackled by their manipulations. I was proud of him. But more than that, I was just glad to see him finally living for himself. As for me, I had already moved on. Completely. I realized I had won. And it wasn't just about getting away from them. It was about finally being free. They could no longer affect my life, and I was okay with that. But then, they tried one more time. One last email. It came out of nowhere, after weeks of silence. The subject line was a half-hearted apology, mixed with an attempt to blame me for ruining their family. It was the same tired rhetoric. They still couldn't see the truth of what had happened. They still couldn't take responsibility. It was all about how I had wronged them, how I was the one who had ruined everything. I didn't bother reading it. I just deleted it. And with that, I was done. But Aaron wasn't done yet. He made his final break. He legally changed his last name. It wasn't just a symbol. It was his way of erasing them completely from his life. The name they had tried to force on him, the name they had used to control him for so long, it was gone. Aaron had taken the final step in cutting them off, and so had I. For the first time, I felt like I could truly breathe. They were gone. Completely. No more manipulations. No more lies. No more guilt trips. And I owed them nothing. I never had. It had been a year since I cut my parents out of my life, and everything was finally quiet. No more phone calls. No more emotional blackmail. No more people trying to guilt trip me. I had moved on. I was thriving. My career had taken off, and I had begun to rebuild relationships with people who actually cared about me. Friends, colleagues, and even a few family members who had stayed supportive all this time were still there for me. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Aaron was doing even better. His transformation over the past year was nothing short of remarkable. He was living independently, healthy, and in a better place than I ever imagined he could be. He had learned to stand on his own, free from the toxic grip of our parents. He was even making plans for his future, things I hadn't seen him do in years. As for our parents, the silence was deafening. They had completely disappeared. At first I thought it was just them licking their wounds, unable to cope with the social fallout. But as the months went by, no one had heard from them. They had vanished from social media, from family gatherings, from every corner of the world we had once known. I had assumed they were just hiding in shame, unable to face the consequences of their actions. But that assumption was shattered when I received an anonymous email one evening titled, "You deserve to know the truth." The subject alone made my blood run cold. I hesitated before opening it. The message inside was more than I expected. It contained evidence, documents, bank statements, transactions that showed my parents had been hoarding money for years, money they could have used to support me when I was a child. Instead, they had selfishly kept it all for themselves, even as I was sent off to foster care and left to fend for myself. The email didn't just stop there. It also hinted at something I had never imagined, a forgotten inheritance. The sender claimed I might have legal rights to some of the money my parents had hoarded. They suggested there were assets I could claim, hidden away from the world, assets that might still be left behind. I sat there for a long time staring at the screen. Part of me didn't even want to believe it. But at the same time, I knew this was exactly the kind of thing they'd do. They were always about the money, always about control. I forwarded the email to Aaron. His reaction, shocked, but not surprised. He had always known that our parents had been selfish when it came to money. He'd seen it for years, their tendency to hoard, to flaunt what they had while we struggled. It was almost like they wanted to make sure we never had a chance to succeed. Aaron agreed we needed to look into it. So I reached out to a lawyer. I needed to know if I had any claim to the assets they had left behind. The lawyer reviewed everything and confirmed that yes, there were some legal avenues I could explore. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about the money. It was about justice. Before I could even decide whether to take further action, my parents resurfaced. It wasn't much, just a desperate letter. The letter was full of pleas. They claimed they were in a financial bind, that they were facing extreme hardships, and they begged me for help. They tried to spin it as if I was their last hope. They even mentioned how I owed them because of everything they'd done for me in the past. The hypocrisy was overwhelming. It was almost laughable. Here they were, after everything they had done, abandoning me, manipulating me, and pushing me to the edge, and they were now begging for my help? The same people who had destroyed my childhood were now the ones asking for mercy. I thought about it for a moment, but then it hit me. Karma had come full circle. They had hoarded wealth while I suffered. They had everything they needed but chose not to help. And now they were reduced to begging for my assistance. I didn't respond to their letter. I didn't even acknowledge it. Because the truth was, they had already made their choices. They had already destroyed their own lives. I didn't owe them a single thing, not a cent, not a minute of my time. Nothing. And that was when Aaron made his final move. He legally severed his connection to them forever. He filed the paperwork, officially changing his last name and erasing any trace of them from his life. For him, it wasn't just about cutting ties. It was about claiming his own identity, free from the suffocating grip they had once had on him. With Aaron's final cut, it became official. We were both free. As for our parents, they had nothing left. They had lost their reputation, their wealth, and any support they once had. No one was there to help them. And in the end, they were left to face the consequences of their greed and selfishness. And me, I had already won. Whether or not I chose to claim any money from their hoarded assets didn't matter anymore. I didn't need it. The real victory was in the freedom I had gained. Freedom from the pain, the manipulation, and the toxic family dynamic. It was the perfect ending. Aaron and I had finally rebuilt our brotherhood, stronger than ever. We didn't need our parents to do that. We were free. And as for them, they faded into irrelevance, left with nothing but the ruins of their own choices. I was at peace, and I would never look back.
Hey everyone, I'm 20M, currently in college, and the oldest child in what looks like a perfect family from the outside. We've got that polished look, family photos where we're all smiling, nice cars in the driveway, and parents who go out of their way to make us look like the ideal household. But peel back the layers, and it's like opening up Pandora's box. I feel like I've been carrying around a lot of secrets, and now I'm finally reaching a breaking point. Growing up, I was always the good kid. I did what I was told, didn't cause trouble, and stuck to the image my parents wanted for me. They drilled into me early on that family reputation matters more than anything else. They've always been clear, whatever happens inside our home, stays inside. Failing to live up to that perfect image isn't an option, not for any of us. But here's the thing. My younger brother, who's 17 now, has struggled for a long time with substance abuse. It's something my parents have tried to bury for years. They wouldn't let him get help when he first started getting into trouble, afraid someone might find out. Instead, they'd come up with excuses for why he'd missed school or why he seemed off around family friends, and every time he slipped up, it was like it was somehow my responsibility to cover for him. The whole covering up situation came to a head recently. My brother got involved in a serious incident involving drugs and was arrested. This wasn't just something you could brush under the rug or pass off as typical teenage behavior. He's in serious legal trouble, and the police had to get involved. My parents did their best to keep it hidden from everyone, from extended family to close neighbors. They even had me lie to my friends, telling them that he was studying abroad to explain his absence. At first, I went along with it because I'd been taught to prioritize the family over everything else. But the more I had to lie for him, the heavier it started to feel. I was covering for him, trying to keep up this ridiculous front, while he made mistake after mistake with no real consequences. My parents kept pretending he was the same as any other kid on the block, and that all of this was just some unfortunate phase. Then came the tipping point. My parents sat me down one night and told me that, as part of our family loyalty, I needed to keep up this story. They wanted me to go around telling anyone who asked that he was away, studying hard in a foreign country, and that there was no issue at home. I couldn't believe it. They were asking me to tell some elaborate lie, just to keep up the image that everything was fine. That's when I told them I couldn't keep lying for them anymore. I was done. I had spent my entire life playing by their rules, keeping every family secret under wraps, but this felt different. I knew they'd be furious, but I couldn't keep pretending my brother was fine when he clearly wasn't. I could see the look on my dad's face when I told them no, like I'd broken some unspoken rule that had been set in stone for as long as I could remember. And then came the blow-up. My mom went from shock to hurt to absolutely livid in record time. She said this was what real family loyalty looked like, and that I was being selfish. My dad, who's usually the more even-tempered one, sat back with his arms crossed, watching like he expected me to eventually cave. But I wasn't backing down. I told them that if they wanted to keep up their story, they'd have to do it without me. In response, they laid down an ultimatum. Either I play along, or they cut off my financial support, including for college. My dad spelled it out, plain and simple. If I wasn't on their side, I was on my own. That night, I went to my friends and spilled the whole thing. These were people who knew my family from the outside, who'd always assumed we were this picture-perfect group. They couldn't believe the lengths my parents were willing to go to just to keep a perfect family image intact. A few of them even offered to help me figure things out if my parents did decide to cut me off. They told me I didn't deserve to be dragged into this mess. And honestly, it was the first time I felt like maybe I could finally break free from all the expectations my parents had piled onto me. When I got home, I tried one last time to reason with them. I suggested we tell people he was struggling with something personal, but leave out the legal troubles. But they wouldn't budge. They said the family couldn't afford even the smallest hint of scandal. My mom pulled out all the stops, crying and saying she couldn't survive the humiliation if people knew the truth about my brother. That's when I realized that I was done. I couldn't keep sacrificing my integrity for the sake of their perfect image. So here I am, sharing my story. I've seen how Reddit can help people in tough spots, and I guess I just need to know I'm not completely off base for wanting to stand up for myself. For once, I want to be more than just the guy who cleans up everyone else's mess. Update 1. So, things blew up fast. After I refused to cover for my brother anymore, my parents didn't just sit around. They went straight into damage control mode and spun their own version of the story to our extended family. Before I knew it, relatives started calling and texting, one after another, all echoing the same sentiment: I was being selfish and ungrateful. I'd always been the one expected to hold everything together, so their reactions stung, but I could see where they were getting their version of events. My parents must have told them that I'd refused a simple favor for the family, that I was going against our values. I could hear it in the tone of my aunt's message, where she said she never thought I'd let everyone down like this. She didn't ask me what was going on. She just assumed what my parents told her was the full story. One by one, family members who used to be on my side started dropping off. A few cousins I'd been close to stopped responding to my messages altogether. The aunts and uncles I'd grown up with started sending one-liners like "hope you come to your senses soon and remember who's always been there for you." It was obvious my parents were painting me as the problem, the one who turned their back on the family. Then came my aunt's intervention. She arranged a family meeting at her house, saying she wanted to help clear things up and get everyone back on the same page. I agreed to go, hoping maybe I'd finally get a chance to explain what was really happening. But the minute I walked in, I could tell what kind of meeting this was. My aunt, 2 uncles, and even some cousins were there, and it was clear they'd already been fed my parents' side of the story. The whole time, they talked about family loyalty and how disappointed they were that I wasn't willing to support my brother. No one asked for my perspective. They didn't seem to care that I'd been carrying the weight of my brother's secrets for years. All they saw was that I'd finally refused to play along with the family act. When I pushed back, trying to explain that I couldn't keep lying for my brother, they didn't want to hear it. They kept bringing up how my parents had done everything for me, and how I owed it to them to keep the family together. It was almost like they'd rehearsed it. I walked out halfway through, realizing that this wasn't a meeting, it was an ambush. After that, my parents reinforced their ultimatum. They told me they'd cut off everything if I didn't fall back in line. I was on a full scholarship for tuition, but they'd been helping with rent, food, and other expenses. Now, they made it clear all of that would be gone if I didn't keep up appearances. They even threatened to block my access to the family car, which I'd been using to get to and from work. Realizing I could actually be on my own soon, I started looking for part-time work. I picked up applications at a few stores and began updating my resume. I was lucky to have some savings, but without help, those wouldn't last long. My friends were amazing, though. A few offered to let me crash with them if things got bad, even though I could tell they were a little shocked by how quickly everything had spiraled. But that didn't stop my mom from piling on the pressure. She called, saying that the stress I was causing her was making her health worse. She kept telling me she couldn't handle this level of betrayal and that I was pushing her to the breaking point. Every call felt like an emotional battle. My dad didn't get as emotional, but he made it clear he thought I was being reckless. He said I was breaking the family apart and that I was risking everything for no good reason. But even with all the guilt they threw at me, I couldn't just go back to being the cover-up guy. My friends stepped up even more. They started brainstorming ways to help me stay afloat financially and offered to help with whatever I needed. Their support kept me going, and for the first time I started thinking I might actually be able to get out from under my parents' thumb. On top of everything, I decided to talk to someone about the legal stuff. I went for a consultation to see if my parents had any legal hold over me now that I was technically an adult. Luckily, I found out they couldn't do much legally, but the financial control they had over me was still a big issue. Meanwhile, my brother, who's the root of all this, stayed quiet. No apology, no acknowledgement of the mess he's left behind. He seemed totally fine with me taking all the heat for his mistakes, which only added to my frustration. And then, things took an unexpected turn. My initial Reddit post went viral. People were sharing it, and I got flooded with comments and messages from strangers offering advice and support. Many people were outraged at my parents' demands and praised me for standing my ground. Reading through the responses, I felt this sense of relief, like maybe I wasn't completely out of line for wanting to live my own life without constantly covering up for my family. I decided to reach out to a few extended family members myself, hoping I could get through to at least some of them. But most of them had already made up their minds. They'd heard my parents' side, and they didn't seem interested in anything I had to say. It felt like I was talking to a wall. Then, true to their word, my parents cut off my access to the family car. They'd told me to make my own way if I was so determined to be independent. It was one of the last strings tying me to them, and now that was gone too. As overwhelming as all this has been, the support from Reddit has been a lifeline. Seeing strangers stand by me, offering advice and encouragement, has helped me feel like I'm not alone in this. It's given me the strength to keep pushing forward, no matter what my family throws at me. Update 2. After the family intervention backfired, my parents escalated things even more. I got a message from my mom telling me they were done dealing with my betrayal, and right after that, they blocked my phone number. They didn't just block me though, they blocked me on all our family communication apps and social media. It felt like they were trying to cut me off completely, like if they just hit block, the problem would go away. My friends noticed how stressed I was getting, so they helped me brainstorm a plan for financial independence. With no more help from my parents, I had to get creative. We decided to set up a GoFundMe, and I made a post explaining my situation. I laid out everything as clearly as I could. My family had cut me off because I refused to lie about my brother's problems, and now I was on my own to cover my education and living expenses. The post took off. People started sharing it, and soon it spread to other social media platforms. I wasn't expecting much attention, but strangers and friends alike rallied around me, donating what they could. My parents must have seen it, because a few days later I heard from my aunt. She was furious, saying I was airing dirty laundry and embarrassing the family. I asked her if she'd even heard my side of the story, but she didn't want to hear it. She just kept saying I was damaging the family's reputation. Not long after, I ran into another family member who was also on my parents' side. I decided to tell them the full truth right there. I explained how my parents had expected me to cover up for my brother, even when he got arrested, and how they threatened to cut me off if I didn't. At first, they didn't believe me, but I stuck to my story, laying out every detail. By the end of it, they didn't say much. They just looked at me, speechless, like they were finally beginning to question things. The shocker came when my brother reached out. For the first time since this all started, he actually called me. Instead of owning up to his actions or apologizing, he begged me to stay quiet for his sake. He said I was making things worse for him, that if people knew about his arrest, he'd never be able to get his life back on track. I listened, but I couldn't bring myself to go back on what I'd already said. I told him he needed to face his mistakes, and that I couldn't keep sacrificing myself to cover up for him. He didn't respond well to that. He got angry, blaming me for ruining his life and insisting that I was being selfish. This was when I started questioning everything. Was I really willing to lose my family over this? I'd grown up thinking family was everything, and yet here I was, with my entire family basically turned against me. But then I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to uphold this false image, sacrificing my own mental health and integrity just to keep them happy. I realized I couldn't keep going down that road. Around this time, a family friend reached out, someone who knew a bit about what was going on. They offered me a part-time job at their business, knowing I needed a way to support myself. I jumped at the chance. It felt like a lifeline, and I was grateful to have at least one person on my side. With the GoFundMe and this job, I started to see a way forward. I even began looking at small apartments with a couple of friends who were open to the idea of sharing a place if I needed to move out. Meanwhile, back at home, things were starting to unravel. I heard from mutual friends that rumors were circulating about my family in the community. It seems that as my post gained more traction, people began piecing things together, and my parents were getting increasingly desperate to control the narrative. My mom was apparently devastated that their perfect family image was cracking, and they tried to reach out indirectly, making threats through mutual acquaintances. They claimed I was defaming them and hinted at potential legal action, which felt surreal. I wasn't spreading lies, I was just finally telling the truth. Despite the pressure from my family, the online support kept growing. Strangers started sending messages of encouragement, and some even offered to help cover essentials until I could fully support myself. It was overwhelming, but in the best way. I started to feel more sure of my decision to stand my ground, knowing so many people had my back. Then, out of nowhere, my brother's tone changed completely. His messages shifted from pleading to outright anger. He accused me of ruining his life, as if my decision not to lie was somehow worse than his choices. His words were harsh, almost desperate, and it became clear that he wasn't ready to take any responsibility for what he'd done. It hurt, but I didn't let it change my decision. Some of my extended family members, however, started coming around. After my GoFundMe and Reddit post went viral, a few of them reached out, saying they were beginning to see things from my side. They admitted they hadn't realized the pressure my parents had put on me for so long. It wasn't a huge shift, but knowing some family members believed me was reassuring. Seeing the lengths my friends were going to help, they decided to organize a small event to raise additional funds. They even planned a little get-together with donations and support from people I'd never even met, all pitching in to help me get back on my feet. With every new show of support, my resolve strengthened. My parents were still trying to control me, still convinced I'd eventually come crawling back. But thanks to everyone who stood by me, I feel stronger than ever. I'm not backing down now. Update 3. Things took an unexpected turn when a relative I barely knew reached out. She was an older cousin of my mom's, someone who'd always been distant at family gatherings. Somehow, she'd found out about my situation through a mutual connection, and she reached out with a message of support. It wasn't just words, either. She offered both moral and financial help, saying she couldn't stand seeing what my parents were putting me through. She even contributed to my GoFundMe without me asking, just quietly showing her support in a way I never expected from anyone in the family. But while this one relative backed me, the situation with my brother exploded online. Somehow, the details of his arrest leaked. It wasn't my doing, but it didn't matter. Once the truth was out, people were quick to connect it to my story. News of his arrest and the charges he faced started spreading through social media, which caught everyone off guard. My parents, who'd spent years building this reputation in the community, suddenly found themselves the center of a scandal. Friends and neighbors who'd once admired them were now looking at them differently, and I started hearing from family friends who were shocked at the extent of the cover-up. The fallout hit fast. My parents had built their lives around their social circle, so when people began questioning their choices, it shook them hard. Suddenly, the same people who used to send me messages about family loyalty and supporting my brother were silent. My mom's friends stopped showing up at her events, and there were rumors of people pulling away from their usual gatherings. It was like their social circle had frozen over in a matter of days. A few days later, my parents reached out again. They didn't apologize, but they had a different tone. Instead of demands, they started talking about finding a solution to avoid any further embarrassment. They offered a deal. If I stopped posting and deleted my Reddit account, they'd consider reinstating my educational funds and maybe even help with living expenses. It was the closest they'd come to compromise, but it wasn't exactly an apology or acknowledgement of the pressure they'd put on me. After thinking it over, I decided to meet them halfway. I offered a partial agreement. I'd stop posting if they gave me full control of my educational funds with no strings attached. That way, I could still finish college without relying on them any further. They seemed to agree, and soon after I received draft legal papers. But when I looked them over, I saw they'd slipped in extra clauses that would essentially restrict me from speaking about my family at all, both now and in the future. I shared the draft with Reddit, and the feedback was loud and clear: don't sign. People warned me about how restrictive those clauses were, and how they could potentially use them against me later on. My friends helped me find a lawyer who confirmed the same thing, so I rejected the offer. I told my parents if they couldn't respect my independence, I wouldn't be signing anything. Not long after, another Reddit user offered me a job in a nearby city. It was a fresh start, far from my family drama, and a chance to live independently. I took it, packed up my things, and started making plans to move out completely. Leaving the place I'd called home was hard, but I knew it was the right step. With the GoFundMe, my 2 part-time jobs, and help from supportive people both online and offline, I finally saw a way forward without relying on my parents. The day I moved out, my parents made one last attempt to regain control. They warned me they'd take me off their health insurance if I left without signing the agreement. It felt like they were clinging to whatever control they still had, but I was done letting them dictate my life. I told them I'd figure it out myself and walked out the door. Within days of my move, I heard more bad news about my brother. He'd gotten involved in another incident and was facing additional legal trouble. This time, it wasn't just a minor issue. It sounded like he was getting in over his head, with more charges piling up. My parents were in full crisis mode, but I didn't feel any obligation to get involved. I'd spent years being the one to fix things, but now I was finally free from that responsibility. The cousin who'd reached out before stepped up again, offering additional financial support to help with my education. She told me she respected my decision to stand my ground and wanted to make sure I finished school. Her help came at just the right time, and I couldn't be more grateful. It felt like she was a lifeline when my own parents had left me to struggle. For the first time in years, I felt truly independent. I was in control of my own life, with no one trying to dictate my decisions or force me to cover up for their mistakes. I could finally focus on my studies, my job, and building a life that was mine alone. The support from Reddit and even unexpected family members had given me a sense of freedom I hadn't realized I was missing. Now, I'm settled into my new life, keeping my focus on building a future that doesn't revolve around anyone else's expectations. I haven't spoken to my parents since I left, and while they've tried to reach out a few times, I haven't responded. I'm not ready to deal with them again, especially with my brother still causing chaos back home. Every day, I feel a little stronger and more sure of my decision. It's been a long journey, but I'm finally in a place where I can live for myself, not for someone else's idea of who I should be. And for that, I'm grateful to everyone who stood by me, even strangers online who helped me find my way to freedom. Update 4. Settling into my new life was surreal at first. With my own place, a stable job, and a new network of supportive people, I finally felt the freedom that had been out of reach for so long. Moving away from my parents' control gave me the space I'd needed to think clearly, to set my own priorities, and most importantly, to live without constant anxiety over their expectations. A few weeks after I settled in, the consequences of everything that had come out were hitting my parents hard. Their social circle, once loyal and unquestioning, had all but vanished. People in their community knew about my brother's issues, and many were disappointed in my parents for the lengths they'd gone to keep up appearances. I even heard that my mom was struggling to maintain her social engagements. The perfect family facade was crumbling, and I was no longer the one trying to hold it together. Meanwhile, my brother's situation worsened. News spread that he'd been caught up in more legal trouble, and this time there was no way to spin it. My parents were forced to handle everything on their own, with no more family interventions or quick fixes. From what I heard, they tried to shield him from the worst consequences, but without my support or anyone else willing to cover up, they were left facing the full weight of his actions. It wasn't easy to watch from afar, knowing he was still making the same mistakes, but I knew I couldn't let myself get pulled back into that mess. Around this time, I got invited to speak at a local event. A friend of mine who'd supported me through everything was involved with a community outreach group, and they wanted me to share my story with others dealing with controlling family dynamics. I spoke about standing up for myself, setting boundaries, and learning to prioritize my own well-being. Surprisingly, it resonated with a lot of people who'd been in similar situations, and some came up afterward to thank me for sharing. It was eye-opening to see how common these issues were, and how much people needed to hear that it was okay to prioritize themselves over toxic family dynamics. After that event, I started reconnecting with some extended family members who'd initially cut me off. A few aunts and uncles reached out, apologizing for not believing me earlier. They said they could now see the truth behind my parents' actions, especially with the way my brother's troubles had played out publicly. Though not everyone came around, some relationships started to mend, and for the first time in a while, I felt like I could rebuild parts of my family without compromising my own boundaries. My story on Reddit continued to gain traction, and to my surprise, it became a bit of a rallying point for others dealing with similar issues. People shared their own stories and thanked me for encouraging them to stand up for themselves. Some even reached out privately, asking for advice on how to handle family dynamics that seemed all too familiar to my own. Seeing how many people could relate to my situation inspired me to keep sharing, to let people know they weren't alone in facing this kind of struggle. Out of nowhere, my brother reached out again. This time, he seemed genuinely remorseful, saying he finally understood how his actions had affected me and our family. He admitted that he'd used me as a shield for far too long, and while he didn't go into details, he seemed to realize he had a lot of work to do to repair his own life. I wasn't ready to fully trust his intentions yet, but it felt like a step forward. We agreed to keep communication open, at least in a limited way, as he worked through his issues. Then, surprisingly, my parents also tried to reach out. With their social standing damaged and my brother's troubles out in the open, they had little left to lose. They apologized, not for the control they'd tried to exert over me, but for how things got out of hand. They talked about wanting to mend our relationship, but I could tell they still hadn't fully grasped the impact of their behavior. I decided I'd accept limited contact, on my terms, making it clear that I wouldn't be manipulated again. I set boundaries, letting them know I wouldn't entertain any attempts to control or guilt trip me. With my educational funds secured, my job going well, and my studies on track, I felt financially stable for the first time. I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I could finally plan for my future, knowing I was doing it on my own terms. Completing my degree felt like a huge victory, a goal I'd achieved without the burden of my parents' expectations. Feeling empowered by my journey, I started using online forums to help others going through similar family struggles. I shared what I'd learned, hoping my story could offer the same support that had gotten me through my hardest moments. Watching others find strength and set their own boundaries was incredibly fulfilling. I've come to realize that family isn't always about who you're related to by blood. Sometimes it's about who stands by you, supports you, and respects you. Over the past year, I've built a close group of friends and mentors who feel more like family than anyone I'd grown up with. This chosen family has taught me more about trust, respect, and acceptance than I ever thought possible. Now, as I look back, I'm grateful for the difficult journey that brought me to this place of independence and self-respect. I've learned that it's okay to put myself first, to refuse to be a puppet in someone else's life story. My hope is that by sharing my journey, I can inspire others to break free from toxic family dynamics and find the courage to live authentically. Thank you to everyone who supported me, both in real life and online. You've been a huge part of my journey, and I hope my story can help others find the strength to stand up for themselves too. This chapter of my life is officially closed, and I'm ready to start the next one, building a life filled with honesty, respect, and genuine connections. Update 5. In the months since I broke away from my family, my life has taken on a new shape. I've built a strong circle of friends and mentors in my new city, people who support me without strings attached. For the first time, I feel like I'm part of a community that values me for who I am, not for how well I keep up appearances. This support system has been a game changer, filling the gap left by family ties. Then, something surprising happened. My parents made a public apology. Out of nowhere, they posted a long message on social media, admitting they'd been wrong in how they'd treated me. They said they were sorry for expecting me to lie for my brother, for pressuring me, and for cutting off my support when I stood up for myself. They talked about how they'd reflected on their actions and understood the damage they'd caused, promising they were trying to change. When I first saw the post, I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me wanted to believe they were finally realizing their mistakes, but I couldn't ignore the timing. They'd already lost much of their social standing, and my story had spread widely. It was hard not to wonder if this apology was more about repairing their reputation than genuinely making amends. I decided to keep my guard up, focusing on what I'd already built for myself rather than getting drawn back in by their words. After my parents' apology, more extended family members reached out. Some apologized for not listening to me sooner, while others shared that they'd dealt with similar treatment from my parents over the years. I realized I wasn't the only one who'd felt pressured or controlled by them. This new connection with extended family helped me feel less isolated, and I appreciated the support they offered, even if it came late. Looking back, the journey has been difficult, but I can see how every painful moment pushed me toward independence. I don't regret standing up for myself, even though it cost me family relationships. Without that experience, I wouldn't be where I am now, surrounded by people who genuinely care about my well-being. As for my brother, his situation hasn't improved. He's still in legal trouble, and from what I hear, my parents are struggling to deal with it alone. They're facing the reality of his actions without anyone else to shield him. It's difficult knowing that he's on a destructive path, but I've made peace with the fact that I'm not responsible for fixing it. I can only hope he finds his way without dragging me down with him. Despite their apology, I've decided to set firm boundaries with my parents. I keep communication minimal, allowing for only occasional updates. I've made it clear that I won't tolerate manipulation or guilt trips, and so far, they've respected those boundaries. It's been a relief to maintain a sense of control over our interactions, knowing I can walk away if things turn toxic again. Online, my story has continued to resonate with others. Reddit followers keep reaching out, sharing their own stories of breaking free from toxic family dynamics. Their encouragement reminds me that I'm not alone in this, and I'm grateful for the support from people who understand the struggle of putting self-respect over family loyalty. Recently, I decided to start therapy. Growing up under my parents' control left some emotional scars, and I realized I needed help to fully process everything I'd been through. Therapy has been eye-opening, helping me understand the patterns I was raised with and how to move forward without carrying the weight of those past expectations. It's given me a clearer perspective on the life I want to build, one that's defined by my choices, not someone else's. Professionally, things are looking up. After months of hard work at my new job, I received a promotion. This milestone reinforced my sense of self-worth and independence. I earned it on my own, without any connections or strings pulled by family. I feel more confident than ever in my ability to succeed, and it's exciting to imagine what else I can accomplish now that I'm free to focus on my own goals. With more freedom and stability, I've been exploring new hobbies I never had the chance to try before. I've taken up painting, something I always wanted to do but never pursued. I've also started hiking with friends, discovering a love for the outdoors. It feels like I'm finally discovering who I am, without any restrictions holding me back. Just when I thought things had settled, my parents reached out again. This time, they suggested we try family counseling to rebuild our relationship. They seemed serious about wanting to make things right, and for a moment, I considered it. But after everything, I knew I wasn't ready. I still need time to heal, to find my footing fully, before diving back into such a complicated relationship. I told them I'd think about it in the future, but for now, I needed space. Each day, I feel more assured in my decision to break away and build a life on my own terms. Every milestone, whether it's a new friend, a career achievement, or simply the joy of a new hobby, reminds me that I'm capable of thriving without parental support. I'm finally living a life that's mine, free from the shadow of someone else's expectations. To everyone on Reddit who's been following my journey, thank you. Your encouragement has kept me going through some of the hardest times, and knowing my story has helped others find their own strength means the world to me. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that self-respect is worth more than any loyalty that comes at the cost of your well-being. Family should be a source of support, not a burden to carry. This chapter of my life is officially closed. I'm ready to move forward, focusing on a future filled with honesty, growth, and genuine relationships. For anyone out there struggling with similar issues, I hope my story shows you that it's okay to put yourself first. It's not easy, but sometimes the hardest path is the one that leads to true freedom.